Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about some new lands and answering the question, are basic lands becoming too basic? So first, what we're going to be doing...
Mitch?
Yeah?
I'm having some second thoughts about this episode.
Okay, so you don't want to be on it then?
I want to be on it. I just think there might be someone who fits the episode just a little bit better than you.
Well, I don't think,
Okay, let's do this. Hello, and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Eddie. Glad to have you here. Today on the show, we have Alec. Hello, Alec.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Good.
Good. All right, so as Mitch started to say, we're going to talk about lands today. All aspects of lands, in particular, how the new Zendikar lands, the MDFCs as they're called, Modal dual-faced lands, and how they should be added or maybe not added to those decks.
Yeah, and specifically we'll be talking about whether or not we feel like basic lands are worth it in Commander decks anymore. We have so many different options now for lands. Are there even spaces for basic lands anymore?
Yeah, these are important questions. I mean, every Commander player, the first thing you got to do before you can play a game is build a deck, and this is one of those fundamentals of deck building, is building out your mana base. So these are going to have a big impact, and we'll try to help guide you through the process.
Yeah. So when we think about, whether or not to include basic lands or these new Zendikar lands in our decks, we have to start thinking about what things are important for lands in Commander overall. First one that, normally comes up is just price. We've got the original duels, the Zendikar fetches, shock lands versus basics and guild gates. We've got a large spectrum when it comes to the price of the different lands that you can buy for your decks. So that's pretty important.
Yeah, for sure. And so these Zendikar lands, they're kind of all over the spectrum. We've got mythics, rares, uncommons. We've got lands that have one land on each side. They're ending up kind of in the $2-ish range. So they're in the more affordable side of things. So that might, for the budget-minded players out there, make them a little bit more worth a look at when you aren't including these fetches and shocks and such. And just how to evaluate those on whether they make the cut versus another land that has a different functionality.
Totally. Another thing that's always comes up in Commander games is whether or not your lands come into play tapped or untapped. It really can have a significant impact on your efficiency in the game and casting your spells on curve.
Yeah, and so one reason that these are interesting is because the majority of them, besides the mythics, which you can bolt yourself in for 3, or the dual-faced with lands on both sides, those have the option to enter untapped, whereas all the other ones, the rares, the uncommons, always enter tapped. And, we always whenever there's new cards, you always are like, I gotta try to slot these in, and you think optimistically, maybe I can find the perfect turn to retain the tempo of the game without being interrupted. But at a certain point, if you have too many lands that enter tapped, it's impossible to maintain that optimization.
Yeah, for sure. Also, a common consideration in Commander is whether or not your lands are fetchable. Whether basic land fetching, specific land type fetching. These lands, of course, aren't fetchable for most of the fetch cards that we have available to us. But you have to consider, is it worth that slot of taking away from, if you need an island or if you need a swamp?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even when you're building your own deck that you need to consider this. There's cards like Collective Voyage where you can search for basics. There's cards that destroy a non-basic of an opponent's and they can search their library for a basic. And so if you don't have a sufficient number of basics for both those effects that come up from time to time, along with your own effects like Cultivates that only can find basics, you might just run out and you'll be left behind the table. So
totally.
That's definitely an important part.
And you have to compare them against the other cards that aren't fetchable either, such as like the Tarkir life gain lands, the guild gates. So you have to decide if that trade-off is worth it.
Yeah, interesting stuff. All right. And so the other thing is that these, barring the lands that have lands on both sides, only tap for one color. So especially once we get to decks that have higher color requirements or 3 or more colors, that can be a big downside as well, because even the guild gates, which are very cheap and enter tapped, at least always tap for 2 colors.
Yeah, and that helps with the efficiency too of being able to cast certain spells which have like multiple mana pips of like say the same color. You know, you might be in a 5-color deck, but trying to run a card that's got 3 black pips, that can be difficult on your mana base to run too many cards that just tap for 1 color of mana.
Yeah, so all of these are considerations that we have to think about when we're making mana bases. I think from here, let's talk about what role all of the other lands. So we've talked about like the special lands, Castle Lockthway, and all these other cycles that have additional functionality. But what about just basics? Basics are kind of one of those assumed parts of decks that people just overlook and are deceptively strong. They enter untapped. They're fetchable. You can have any number of them for basically free. They're super cheap monetarily. So in your opinion, what should we talk about when we're just looking at basics, the most boring of lands?
Well, kind of like along the same lines of just like what we just covered when it came to what we consider in terms of lands. Obviously basics are very cheap. Generally, you don't have to spend too much on basic lands.
Yeah.
They enter untapped pretty much all the time, so that's perfect when you're trying to hit a specific curve. They are relatively fetchable for most ramp spells, also other fetched lands, including like Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse. Of course, the downsides are, the number of colors it can tap for, obviously just 1 for each. And then there aren't really any additional functionality. But, on the whole, in my opinion, I feel like the benefits typically outweigh the negatives. But you just have to make the decision of what you need otherwise.
Yeah, and another point that basics sometimes, this is meta-specific, but there are cards like Back to Basics and other land hate cards as the type of deck that involves landfall gets more and more popularized and landfall decks get more and more popularized. The obvious answer is that some people are going to try to answer that with things that shut off non-basic lands. So basics also have that added functionality too, which may or may not affect you depending on other decks that you're playing against, but it's worth consideration for sure.
Now, when we on the flip side, when we talk about the argument for replacing as many basics as you can, Eddie, what do you consider to be like the foremost arguments for replacing them?
For replacing basics? I think especially for these MDFCs, these are causing the community a lot of confusion and there's a lot of different opinions, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for it. It's because they add functionality that basics just can't. They add a level of consistency. Their lands when you need them to be, their spells when you don't. And so if that is valuable to you, then it might be worth consideration. So I think when you're playing basics, it's one of those things that you're never happy to top deck one of them late in the game, whereas some of these cards that we're looking at from these new sets, like the Agadim's Awakening, can be a complete reversal of that, can be a complete blowout, and also can occupy that slot of a basics. But I think you want to keep in mind what the minimum number of basics you want in a deck is. And this is going to be completely personal choice. For me, it's correlated to the color identity of the commander. If it's a 1-color commander, you can certainly have more replacements for basics, but you're going to want to, you also have the option to lean heavily into basics, because like we talked about, they always enter untapped. You're always going to be playing on curve. You're never going to be missing a color pip, especially some decks really need certain color pips, whether you're playing Necropotence or Torbrand. Like you can't necessarily run Reliquary Towers and other colorless cards as half of your mana base, even if you're a 1-color deck. And once you get even higher in that tier of colors, like a 5-color deck, you definitely still want, it depends on the deck, but I would say once you get to 10, you really need to start considering, is this enough basics?
Right, for sure. And then, talking about the argument for the new Zendikar lands as well, I like your comment about functionality. If you think about it, almost like 35% or more of your deck is lands.
Yeah.
And if you choose to just say run all basics, 30%, 35% or more of your deck is then just cards that help you cast your spells, but they aren't really doing much for you otherwise.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's really bad to top deck that basic land when you really need some action.
Mm-hmm.
So the nice thing about the new Zendikar lands is they can act as either. So you can increase the percentage of cards when you draw them that they are either what you need, whether it's a land or if it's a spell.
Mm-hmm.
So the more that you can improve those statistics for you within reason.
Yeah.
I feel like it adds a great benefit to your deck and being able to have a smooth playthrough.
Yeah, and you'll definitely notice this. It's a tricky thing, right? Because they will often, these new MDFCs in particular, will often function as a land 80% or more of the time. And so it's kind of deceptive when you actually play the deck and you play it as a land. You're like, oh, that's nice, that glad I hit my drop. It was nice to have that option. But you'll really notice it those times when they come in clutch. And just the nature of a 100-card singleton, you might not notice it every time, but it's little tweaks like this, little pieces of optimization that can really make your game more enjoyable, let you interact with the board more often, and really further your game plan. So
totally.
Yeah.
So when it comes to our final verdict for playing basics or playing the new Zendikar lands, it depends.
Yes, exactly.
Basically, no matter what anyone says, building a mana base is difficult. It can take a lot of time. It can depend a lot on the cards that you choose to play, and that can change as you bring cards in and out of your deck. So obviously we have a ton of choices when building our decks, and it isn't always clear to know what direction you need to go in. So we've got a few tips for you.
Yeah. So the first one is that you want to build your mana base for your spells. What that means is it takes into account how mana hungry your spells are. For example, I had mentioned Torbrand. He has 3 red pips and 1 colorless. So if you're running all sorts of utility lands like Reliquary Tower or Temple of the False God, you might find yourself on turn 4 unable to cast your commander. And so when you're playing cards that are very mana intensive like this, you need to maybe lean away from all of the utility lands. Again, if you're in a monocolor deck, you can get away with it a little bit easier, but especially if you're looking through your deck list and you don't see a whole lot of generic mana costs, it's something to definitely be aware of, because you're going to run into problems more than if your deck can get by with a bunch of generic mana.
I think one of the most common ways that we see this is when people are playing Niv Mizzet Perrin on turn 6. He requires 6 mana very specifically. And I don't know about you, but so many times I've seen players scuffle around trying to hit that turn 6 Niv Mizzet simply because they just weren't able to build the land base that they needed in order to support his casting cost. So, when you're playing around with cards like that, commanders like that, it's really important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and the next thing we're going to talk about when you're building your mana base is that you need to build for your spells, but also build for your fetches or build for your ramp. So if you have cards that specifically fetch out a certain type, you need to make sure you have enough of that type to be fetched. I know, for example, I have my Queen Marchesa deck. It only has a few red spells, so I only have 2 mountains or so in there, but I have a couple spells that require 3 red pips. So personally, I should probably go back and rebuild my mana base, making sure I'm actually building for those spells. So if I draw that and I draw an Evolving Wilds or what have you, I should be able to then cast that spell. And that applies across the board, that you need to be able to have enough for your fetches and for example, Nature's Lore only fetches Forest, but if you're running low on forest for some reason, it's going to feel bad to search your deck and not be able to find anything to grab with that. So
totally. Then we wouldn't be Commander's Quarters if we didn't talk about building for your budget when it comes to your land base. And, the reality is most decks will do just fine with just basics in their land base. Taking a small step up, Guild Gates, Tarkir, Life Gain lands, and bounce lands and other dual commons are really great because they're still relatively cheap while still providing the additional flexibility of the lands, the colors that they can support. And so you get a little bit more bang out of your buck for that. Sure, you can spend a small fortune on an original dual land, sure, but how many times are you really going to feel the impact of that additional efficiency in that card? Like, you could play a few games without ever drawing the card at all. When thinking about your budget and what to build in it, sometimes the cheaper land base is you just get more out of it for spending less.
Yeah. So also on the budget side of things, we wanted to share one tip and trick that I'm using, and hopefully it'll be useful to some of you as well as you pick up these lands. So I don't know about you guys, but I tend to have my decks, and with those decks I have just an extra box that has all my tokens in it that those decks might need. And what I've begun to do with all these dual-faced cards is basically just have them in clear sleeves. So one of my favorites of this cycle is Balagad Recovery, just as an example. On the flip side, we've got Balagad Sanctuary. So this is basically an Eternal Witness that can, as a sorcery, that could also be a land. And what you can do is get clear sleeves or whatever floats your boat, and just keep these with your tokens. And then you can go to your game store if you happen to pull some of these from packs. They were very common and very, very cheap. You can get a dozen of these for less than $1 oftentimes. But with Zendikar Rising, they provided these blank cards. So on the top line, you put the front face of the card, the second line, the back face, and then in the big blank area, you can basically write the effects of both. And so then you just put this in your actual deck. And if you want, I could make 4 Balagad Recoveries and put them in any green decks that I might want. And I just have to have the single copy of Balagad Recovery in my token box, and anytime I happen to draw that card during the game, I can just grab it right from there. Balagad Recovery is only like a 15-cent card, so this might not be the best example. But for example, the mythic lands can cost, $10 depending on the one you're looking for. And if you want the full art foil, go for it. You can play that every time. So that's one way to kind of make your dollar go a little further.
Yeah, it's super efficient, especially if you find yourself playing a lot of similar colors all the time. Just having one copy of the card instead of needing to invest in 3, 4, 5, 17, however many decks you guys have.
Yeah, and then the nice benefit of the clear sleeves is you also don't need to, pull it out, turn it over, put it back in, and then, flip it around that way. You can just use either side. So just a little tip.
So we wanted to talk to, we've hinted back and forth about, integrating the Zendikar lands into our new decks. So, how do we rate them? Going back to, the scale that we mentioned before when it comes to functionality, budget, enters the battlefield tapped or untapped. So what do you think about the dual lands?
Yeah, so for these, we're referring to the ones that are lands on both sides. So this is Branch Locked Pathway. It's the Selesnya one, enters as either a white source or a green source. They're thoroughly middle of the road in my book. I think they are, if you draw them there, you'll never be embarrassed to put one on the battlefield. They're certainly useful. Obviously, enter untapped, so that's a great benefit. I would say if you happen to have one in your collection and you feel like your deck is running plenty of sufficient basics, that you're not worried about running out for the applicable situation, definitely take one of the basics out, slot one of these in. You won't be unhappy that you did. I think if you're in the fortunate position of having the fetches, having the shocks, having some of the check lands, the ones that verify whether you have a certain type, having the duels, of course, these aren't going to replace those, frankly. They aren't fetchable. They are static once you choose. So if you really need that white mana for a Swords to Plowshares, so you play it as a Plains, but then later on you need a green mana and you're one short, you're out of luck. So I think that they are going to be perfectly fine and acceptable, but not universal. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, my trip for these is that generally I will build my list and have one side of the card, one color of the land in mind when I'm adding it to the list. So take the branch loft pathway. I might look at it and say, like, I need more green pips in my green lands in my deck, so I will focus on that color specifically. And then I'll just consider it as a nice functionality to have it as the other color on the other side if I happen to have drawn all of my forests and my other green sources before I play that land. So it's nice to have the flexibility, but again, I don't feel like it's going to replace most of the other dual lands.
Yeah, plus, I mean, you can't fetch it with Wayfarer's Bauble, so what's the point, really?
Yeah, disappointing.
Heresy. All right. So we've talked about the dual-faced lands. Next, we're going to address our philosophy on the spell lands. So these are lands from uncommon all the way up to mythic that have a spell on one side and a land on the other. So the mythics, such as, here we have Agadim's Awakening. It is a sorcery on one side, land on the other. The land for the mythics is interesting because it says, as Agadim the Undercrypt enters the battlefield, you may pay 3 life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped, and it taps to add black mana. So you can basically bolt yourself. It's an extra shock, but it still only taps for the black. But you have that option. And then on the other side, they, in this case, have a sorcery. Pretty good one, I might add. It's X and triple black to return from your graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards that each have a different converted mana cost X or less. And these are basically the same way the rest of the way down, except for the rares and the uncommons always enter the battlefield tapped. You don't have the option to shock yourself, to bolt yourself, to make it untapped. So what's our initial analysis here of the spell lands?
So the majority of them, of course, enter the battlefield tapped, so not great when considering that component. And then the functionality of the card tends to, vary wildly. Mm-hmm. So, you kind of need to analyze them based off of, what they're going to add to your deck. If your deck runs a particular theme that it's like particularly important for. So that's going to be important. Similar, certain cards such as like Bala Ged Recovery, Sajiri Shelter seem like pretty much auto includes for certain decks, especially like for ones that just need more recursion or ones that need more protection. Yeah. It's great to have that flexibility in a land. But I kind of like to see them kind of like cycle lands. So we will play them as a land for most of the time, but we'll add that additional flexibility, just like the cycle lands you see from, say, like Amonkhet.
Right.
Just it's nice to have, but you're typically not going to use it most of the time.
Yeah, and I would say if you have one of these in your hand and it's either hold onto the card for the spell half later or miss your land drop, like always play the land. Don't be missing land drops most of the time. Just bite the bullet, play the land as a tapped land, forego the spell, because you never know what you're going to draw. You want to be able to cast those cards later on, and missing your land drop generally isn't going to be the right move for these.
Yeah. And then we kind of go down more towards the bottom end of the functionality when you look at cards such as like Skyclave Cleric or Akum Warrior.
Oh, yeah.
Can be amazing like draft
Yeah, and limited,
cards.
these are great.
Yeah, but when it comes to Commander, just the fact that they are mostly vanilla creatures can seem a little underwhelming.
For sure, yeah.
Okay.
And as Alex said, you're going to want to look for synergy within your deck. So if the spell half is something that you would have included in your deck, even if there wasn't a land on the other side, then that should be a tip to you that this might be a good spot for that card. For example, the red mythic, the Shatter Skull, it offers some direct damage to either creatures or planeswalkers, and I've got a Firesong and Sunspeaker deck that loves flinging out fireballs in red, so that's scary. A card that probably would play that card anyway. And especially as additional sets come out, there's been some strong hints pointing that these are not going to be the last iterations of these MDFCs. So we're going to have more and more decisions to make, but thankfully you'll also probably come across cards that more and more synergize with existing decks. So keep an eye out for any existing synergy, and that's going to be a good tip that this might be the deck for that card.
Totally.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you can make the decision yourself as to whether or not to play basics or not, or these new Zendikar lands. But otherwise, I think that's all we have for today. So thank you again for joining, and have a good one.
Have a good one.